Tonight we're in Reading, and welcome to Question Time. And with me tonight, the Secretary of State for Education, Damien Hines, the former Head of Liberty, Labour's Shadow Attorney General, Shami Chakrabarti, the co-creator of Innocent Drinks, Richard Reed, the editor of the Daily Mirror, Alison Phillips, and the television presenter and author, Richard Madeley. Thanks very much, and as always on Question Time, if you want to argue from home, you know our hashtag BBCQT to get you onto social media. Let's have our first question tonight, which is from Sue Scrace. Please, Sue Scrace.
With so few grammar schools and many applicants for these places, should we have more?
Should we have more grammar schools? I don't think we've had that question for some time. Should we have more grammar schools? Richard Reed?
Well, I think the one thing we can all agree is we've got to do better by the kids in this country. We've got to improve education. I think we have to have within that an ability for people that are on one track to be supported to get even further. I am nervous, though, about putting one set of kids in one school, type of school, and another type in another, especially from the age of 11. When I was 11, I was second to the bottom in my class. By the age of 15, I was second to the top. And if you'd have put me in one category at 11, it would have not necessarily been representative of my potential. So I do think we would need to put more into schools and put kids in classes where they're supported by sort of peers of their comparable skill set, but not necessarily actually in separate schools.
Okay. Alison Phillips, if there's such a demand, why not have more?
I think if we thought for one moment that more grammar schools was going to increase social mobility in this country and give more kids the opportunities to do well through life, I'd be right behind them. However, the whole idea of grammar schools is a complete mirage which gets trotted out by the Conservative Party time and again. There is absolutely no evidence that grammar schools help social mobility. There is actually no evidence that they actually increase education achievement either. What we do know now, unfortunately, is the grammar schools that do exist in this country are still predominantly filled by children who come from middle-class families, many of whom, if they weren't having their children at grammar schools, would be paying for them to have a private education. So they're not actually doing what they achieve. If they were doing what they say they are doing, try to achieve, that would be fine. The reality is that they're not. And I think Rich makes a really good point that it's not just the children that are being chosen at 11 to go, it's what about all the children who are being cast off? Yeah. And on a more basic point, when I'm sure a lot of you here tonight, and people watching at home, and my children as well, are in schools where they've got so little money that they're doing away with the teaching assistants, they haven't got books quite often, they haven't got textbooks. Some schools haven't even now got enough paper and pencil. Yet money is still being found to extend the grammar schools.
OK. You in the third row from the back, yes.
Yes, Alison, what you say about social mobility is absolutely right. I teach at one of the comprehensive schools in Reading. About 40%, over 500 of our children are pupil premium, our poorest children. I believe the two grammar schools in Reading have about 8 pupil premium children between them. Grammar schools have had years to sort this out. Throwing 50 million at the most privileged children in the country already is not going to help social mobility in this country.
These people, these children from less privileged backgrounds are competing with people that have been to private schools. Their parents pay for them to get the best education. They're people from poorer backgrounds that get better opportunities based on their ability. And if you take them away, then you're stopping their ability from the start. I went to a state comprehensive school, and I'm not jealous of anyone that went to grammar school. They got better opportunities than me because maybe they're smarter at that age. But if you put everyone in the same category right at that time, then they can still progress It's just saying the best students to be able to compete with students that may be richer and go to private schools.
I really wish that were true, but unfortunately, that if you look at any evidence going back to the 1950s, it all shows that grammar schools just aren't doing anything to help social mobility. And in fact, what they're doing, as the lady said in Reading, is they're actually making it worse in the areas where there are grammar schools, because the people that aren't at those grammar schools are struggling even more.
All right, well, let's hear from the new Secretary of State for Education, Damien Hines.
So we have a growing population. And with a growing population, you need more school places, and I want to have as many good school places as possible. In fact, there have been 800,000 new school places created since 2010, and we need to create more. I want those to be in good schools that have parental demand, and that's across the whole diverse range of schools that we have, which will include, includes local authority maintained schools. It includes academies and free schools and maths schools and big schools and small schools. And the vast majority of them at secondary school are, of course, comprehensive intake, but yes, some of them are selective schools as well.
So how do you decide why there should be selective schools?
So in a budget in a year of £1 billion for creating additional school places, we've set aside £50 million, a relatively small part, to say that those schools where there is parental demand, where there's need, where the population is growing, and crucially, where those grammar schools commit to widening their access and make sure that more children from those disadvantaged backgrounds are able to go, those schools should be able to expand just as others can.
OK, you, sir.
I think in addition to social mobility, you also have to assess the long-term implications of demoralisation and lack of self-esteem of those that don't manage to get in.
All right, let him answer that point.
Well, as I say, we have a diversity of schools. The vast majority of schools at secondary are comprehensive intake. That is the basis of our system. There are some parts of the country, relatively few, where there are both grammar schools and secondary modern schools or high schools. Only about 160 grammar schools. And in those areas, there are also many outstanding secondary modern schools as well. I want all children to be able to go to a good school.
But at a time when...
Hold on a second, I'm going to bring in Shami Chakrabarti.
Oh, hello.
Hello.
So, like the gentleman over there, I went to a comprehensive school and I'm now the Shadow Attorney General and I'm on question time. And it was one of the best life chances I ever had, one of the best things that ever happened to me socially and in terms of my academic learning. It was a properly funded comprehensive school, and there was one element of segregation, that was it was girls only, and that's a whole complicated argument. But in terms of class background, in terms of educational background of the parents, it was really mixed and it worked really, really well for me. Now, what we want, of course, as parents is the best for our particular children, but what we need to have as a country and as citizens is the best for everybody else's children too. So how about having grammar schools for all the children, otherwise known as comprehensive schools? Because of course I'm going to make the argument about austerity and about funding and about teachers who are buying sandwiches for children in their schools, and that's a problem. Austerity is a problem, but even if you had beautifully well-funded schools that were perfect, you had the biggest budget in Whitehall, Minister, there's still a problem, I think, with telling some kids at 11 you pass and other kids you fail, and people really struggle with that all their lives.
Going to the Secretary of Education, you said that you would rather have more good schools, which implies that grammar schools are good schools and comprehensive schools are not.
No, it doesn't imply that. It doesn't imply that. No, as I say, we've expanded the number of school places in the country by over 800,000 since 2010, and there will be many more places to be created, the vast majority of which are going to be in comprehensive intake schools. And you can have good and outstanding schools of all shapes and sizes, single-sex, co-educational, large, small, rural, urban, maintained schools, free schools, math schools, and so on. I believe in a diverse system. I think the diversity of our system is a great strength, and that there should be good parental choice.
Richard, I'll come to you. Hold on a second, Richard. I'll come to you in a moment. But I just want to address Sue Grace's question to you. If you think it's a good thing, the grammar schools are a good thing, she's saying many people want to go to them. Why not have more? Why stop at 50 million?
Well, we're not proposing that at the moment.
I know you're
we're
not,
saying that where there are...
Wait a minute, it's no good saying we're not doing it. I know you're not doing it. Her question is, why don't you do it? If you're so keen on it, And you see people here are against it, some are for it. But if you think there's a big demand for grammar schools, why not have more of them?
Well, there is a demand for new good schools in parts of the country where the population is growing. And, you know, that demand will be satisfied by new schools being created, or quite often by existing schools expanding. You know, every year the school-age population in different year groups gets a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller.
Are you in favour of selection in principle, or are you against selection?
I'm not in favour of a widespread, wholesale return to selection as was envisaged, you know, back in 1944. But I do think there is a role. I think there is a role for those schools. Look, I went to one myself, as it happens, but that's coincidental. There is a role for those kinds of schools, as there is a role for the long list of other types of schools that I went through.
Richard Madeley.
Well, let me say at the outset of this particular programme that I am totally politically non-affiliated. I don't have any affiliation of any kind to any of the parties. I'm very independent in my thinking, I think. So I don't come at this or any other question with any particular political dogma or agenda. I just see it journalistically, really. I actually have I suppose uniquely on the panel, I have an experience of both systems. I went to a grammar school in the East End of London for the first 3 years of my secondary education, and then my parents moved a little further out into Essex, and I went to a comprehensive school. I couldn't see a blind bit of difference, to be honest, in the quality or the standard of the teaching, of the facilities, of the resources. If anything, I enjoyed the comprehensive system a little better because it was just a slightly better school all round. But in terms of the values that the schools represented, grammar versus comprehensive, they were the same. And although in principle, like you, I'm in favour of diversity and choice in education, I think that's healthy. So in principle, I'd say yes to the question, let's have more. In practice, because I went to both, I've always taken an interest in grammar schools and how they perform. And Alison's absolutely right. They don't actually have anything like the success rate that they claim. They're not as good as they pretend to be. So I'd say probably leave the status quo as it is.
OK.
I think to say that entrance to grammar schools isn't like dictated by socioeconomic background is a bit ignorant, because the things that you have to learn to pass the 11+ aren't taught in generalised schools. So unless you can pay for a tutor that's like able to teach you what's in the 11+, you're not going to pass it. It's not taught in state schools anymore, so you need a private tutor.
I absolutely agree. I think what it's not intending to, but what it's doing is really sort of hard baking in inequality in an early age. Now, look, at school, I was a bit of a swot by the time I was 15. I was in the top class. My best friend, Fraser, was in the bottom class. We learnt things from each other. I learnt from him, quite frankly, how to have a bit more fun. He learnt from me that maybe it is worth doing a bit of revision before your exams. And so I believe there's strength in diversity, and things being mixed up a little is good for everyone.
The woman in yellow there. Yes.
Why not fund all schools properly?
Exactly.
Here in Reading, there have been £4.9 million worth of cuts to the school budgets.
No, look, it is difficult doing everything that schools want to do and everything that we expect and want schools to do. Schools do more than ever before. We've got the most talented generation of teachers, I think the most dedicated head teachers, and they are more ambitious than ever for the kids coming through our schools. So it is challenging managing the budget, but it is also true that there is more money going into the school system this year than ever before.
But there's greater demands as well.
No, there are greater demands.
So that money, in real terms, there isn't.
No. So let me finish this.
Yeah,
this,
you
this
finish your
point,
point, and then we hear. Don't shout out while he's talking, then we can't hear either of you.
The typical class of 27 children in primary school gets £130,000 of funding a year this year, which is £10,000. In today's prices, it's £10,000 more than it was a decade ago. Those same 27 children, when they're going to secondary school, will attract £165,000 of funding, which again is more in real terms in today's money than it was 10 years ago. There is more money going into schools, but as I say, there are more demands on schools. Schools do more than ever before, so budgets are tight, and managing them is challenging. I don't get away from that for a moment.
Just on the per capita payment, per child, is the money going up or down, per child in the UK?
So for this year and next year, we are holding constant the per capita real terms, so in today's money.
The actual money.
The actual money. And this is at a time, of course, when pupil numbers are growing. We're holding constant the per pupil real terms.
But those figures may or may not be true, but anybody here who's got a child in a state school at the moment knows that they are really, really struggling.
OK, I'll take... Who was it who was trying to make a point? It was you. Just very briefly, make your point, and then we must move on to another question.
In Reading schools, 43 out of 43 Reading schools are facing cuts at the moment. And the figure for Reading is a minus £281 per pupil of loss in funding.
Well, across the board, there is more money going into schools than ever before. There are also...
Not in Reading.
There are also redistribution happening because there are some parts of the country which historically have been quite badly underfunded compared to others, and so there is a national funding formula which makes some adjustments, but there is at least, you know, albeit a small amount, but at least a small cash increase allocated for every school. The local authority then can make some reallocations according to where, you know, the latest movements in pupil population or for high needs and so on. But the money is there.
OK, you seem to have hit a difficult spot here in Reading. Anyway, we must go on to another question. Before we do, we're in Carnarvon next Thursday. If you want to come to Question Time in Carnarvon, and the week after that in Birmingham, and on the screen is the phone number and the email address you can apply to come. Let's have this question from Chris Stilianou, please.
Has Theresa May's government spent too much time speaking to itself and too little time speaking to the EU?
Richard Reid.
Oh, yes. Look, it's not going very well, is it? We can all agree that the negotiations are not going well. I just do not understand why the government made this crazy decision to put ourselves under a time pressure for the negotiation. That is the stupidest basic error you could ever possibly make. I think that the government is not speaking to the EU enough. I just think it's not speaking to business enough. Business is absolutely clear that, and I speak on behalf of 97% of entrepreneurs in this country, that we think it's a bad idea to come out of the EU. But we accept the result of the referendum. We accept the result of the referendum. But what we're talking about now is coming out of the single market and the customs union. They're three separate things, and those decisions were not made. I asked the government, on behalf of entrepreneurs and therefore the economy and jobs and prices in this country, to please, you can take us out of the EU, but do not take us out of the single market, do not take us out of the customs union. That just leads to faff and pain and making it much harder to trade with our most important partners, and no one benefits from that.
Richard,
and just something else, because on Tuesday, the House of Commons is voting on whether the government should at least keep the option on the table that we could stay in the single market and the customs union. I think this is when the voice of the people needs to be heard again. If you think that we should at least keep that as an option, then please email or call your MP tomorrow and say, it's a good idea to keep it as an option on the table. So yes, I, as a member of the people, even if I voted Leave or Remain, I'd like us to at least keep the opportunity, if we decide to stay in the single market and the customs union, so we can make sure that we can keep trade and keep growing the economy and creating jobs and keeping prices down.
Richard Madeley, you said at the beginning you weren't political, and watching this process, do you think the government spent too much time talking to itself?
I think all of our political parties have spent far too much time talking to themselves, and specifically the government. Yes, it's an utter shambles, as you said, and it's shameful. I would disagree with what you said, though, about needing to stay within the customs union and the single market, because I don't think that the 52% of people who voted to leave had a silent caveat in their heads when they put the tick in that box. They didn't think, yes, we want to leave, but we want to stay in the customs union and the single market. Because if you stay in the customs union and the single market, you're not leaving. You really are. Now, you may or may not be right that it could lead to economic disaster for this country if we do leave them, but I'm sorry, this is democracy. We took a referendum. 52% of people said we want to leave, and that means leaving. In a moment of clarity, a long time ago now it seems, the Prime Minister said Brexit means Brexit, and a few people said, well, what does that mean? Well, it was obvious what it meant. She meant that we were absolutely going to leave hook, line and sinker. And I think,
so what do you make of the process that's going on?
I think the process is a mess. I don't think, well, in fact, I don't think there is a process. I think what we're seeing, as far as the government's concerned, is this lurching from one holding operation to the next, and the clock's ticking. We've got 10 months to go. And I think it is now time for proper leadership on this, a proper acknowledgement that the people have spoken, they want us to leave, that includes leaving both those organisations that you name, and let's get on with it and make it work. And I voted Remain.
But Richard, you're wrong. With respect, you have got your facts wrong. Being part of the EU is a separate decision to being part of the single market, and a separate decision. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Absolutely is. And also, what people aren't being told this, but you can stay as a member of the EEA single market, and that means we can control immigration. We will no longer be in the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. We will be able to be in charge of our own fishing quotas and out of the cap. Those are some of the principal reasons while staying in the single market. What's happening at the moment, and people didn't realise, the Highways Association just recently announced that they are building, at millions and millions of pounds expense, lorry parks in Dover. That is what your money gets spent on if you come out of the single market. If we stayed in, we could spend that money on hospitals and schools. It's a choice between lorry parks and hospitals.
We were told by Remainers before the referendum that just by voting to leave, and as I say, I voted to stay, but just by voting to leave, we'd have instant economic collapse. The economy is doing really well.
We've gone from Richard, again, I have to correct you. We've gone from the best performing economy to the worst. We've gone from best to last. That is not saying that it's all going well. And I never said disaster.
All right.
It's just introducing faff. It's not going to help. It'll be all right, but it's not going to be great.
Thank you. Just pause a moment. The woman with spectacles in the second row from the back there.
I absolutely agree with Richard Madeley. What this country needs is Winston Churchill moment. It needs our government to stand up for the democratic right of what the people voted for and get us fully out of Europe.
Alison Phillips.
I think going back to that original question, have the government spent too much time talking to each other? I mean, it's not even that. They've been squabbling with each other. I mean, it's been pretty shambolic every week for the last 2 years since the referendum, but this week seems to have really put the tin lid on things.
How should that have been resolved?
Well, I think if we had a Prime Minister who was able to either sort of have some discipline or to have some command, some respect from her team around her, or at least to cajole them so that all these public fallouts weren't happening and people briefing against each other. Right. It's embarrassing. We're becoming like a global laughingstock. But what's really, really not funny is the longer that this goes on, the harder it makes us to negotiate a good Brexit for this country. And so however you voted, if you're a Remainer or a Leaver, we are all going to end up worse off by the way this is being mismanaged.
Damien Hines, why can't the Prime Minister sort this out? Why do we have a cabinet divided against itself, with even today threats of resignation?
Well, look, I campaigned for Remain as well, but then we had a vote, and the side I campaigned on lost. We had a situation where the leaders of all the mainstream political parties were recommending to do one thing, and the population said, no, we're going to do the opposite. And in a democracy, you then have to react to that properly. What you cannot do is seek to redefine it or say, oh, well, what they really meant was probably this. Absolutely. You have to act on it in good faith.
So there was a shout from there. Why don't you? And
on the question of why can't we stay in the single market, and Chris's original question was, are we spending too much time talking to the EU? Anytime you talk to anyone in the EU institutions, they will remind you about what they call the indivisibility of the four freedoms, which means that if you're going to have freedom of movement for goods and services, you will also have freedom of movement of people. And that is certainly something that people feel strongly about in this country.
But what about the questioner who asked whether the government spent too much time speaking to itself? What about David Davis? Did he threaten to resign today?
Well, look, what's
going on?
This is an enormous thing we are taking on. You know, leaving the European Union is the biggest change in our international economic relationships during my lifetime. Of course you're going to have a range of views in government, and of course you're going to have debates about, and then you come to a settled view and you implement them. And it will take time to work through all these things with the European Union. And everything I know about EU summits and decision-making tells me that the decision will not be made early, it will be made at the last point it can be made.
Do you think we should leave the customs union?
I think we must leave the customs union, because if you don't leave the customs union, you haven't really left the European Union.
Are you embarrassed by the government speaking to itself all the time and not negotiating with the EU?
Was that a question to me? Yeah. I kind of don't recognise the premise of the question. I mean, we are in constant dialogue at official level, at ministerial level, you know, with counterparts in the European Union. There is also lots of debate in Parliament, and quite right so, that when you've got something as big as this, there must be an opportunity to fully air, fully debate all the different aspects. Right. That is our democracy working properly.
Shami Chakrabarti.
I'll come to question. So the question suggested that the government was speaking to itself more than to the EU, but I agree with Alison that the government's been briefing against itself. If I were Theresa May, and it's hard to imagine, but if, you know, work with me, if I were Theresa May today, I would be so cross with my Secretary of State for exiting the EU, who has been briefing against me and his colleagues. Sources close to David Davis say that he was in the SAS and he knows how to take people out. Now, if that is the government speaking to itself, that is not a government that can deliver the best possible future relationship and negotiate that with Europe.
It's not the firmest ground for the Labour Party, Shami, to be fair, for reaching firm agreement on approach to the European Union.
Well, no, hang on. Our cabinet... Look, the country split over Brexit, families split over Brexit, and now the country has to be united. At least our shadow cabinet is united on this issue.
Apart from Barry.
No.
And a few others.
The bottom line is we are leaving the EU. However we voted, we are leaving the EU, but there is a job to be done of deciding what the future relationship is going to be with the EU. And I think that we have a clearer vision of what that should be, and we are united around it. Even Richard and me, for example, who probably disagree about the EEA, because I think, you know, Norway got into that deal 25 years ago, and Norway and Britain are very different. Norway has a hard border with Sweden. We do not want a hard border on the island of Ireland. There are differences. So we need our own deal. But we still agree that we want access to that market. We want to put jobs and services first, and we can do that. I believe that we can negotiate
access to that market is just a fudge to hold the Parliamentary Labour Party together. That involves staying in the single market, which involves all those other rules and conditions, including freedom of movement that comes with it.
No, because we need to negotiate a new deal for this country.
Let's hear from some members of our audience. You in the front.
So I think Richard's a little bit confused about what leaving the EU means. The single market, the customs union and the ECJ are the beating heart of the European Union. If you don't leave those institutions, you do not leave the European Union. And
what do you think about the question?
I don't want to disagree, but you're wrong. You're factually incorrect. There are 3 separate decisions, and the country made 1. It didn't make 3 separate decisions. They're independent decisions.
On the original question, I think the government has spent too much time talking to themselves. However, they've been hobbled by members of their own party, other people on the Labour benches who want to remain within the EU and make a situation where it's very difficult to go and negotiate on a sound basis. And if all parties came together and actually respected the referendum result, we'd be in a much stronger negotiating position.
The woman over there. I'll take 2 or 3 more members of the audience. Yes, the woman there.
Can any form of Brexit now be implemented in the time that's left available?
What can anything be? Yeah,
yes.
All right. Can it?
Yes, and the EU negotiators are firmly of that belief as well.
Expecting a new deal to be in place by the end of December 2021 at the latest.
We are all agreed it's been a bit shambolic. It's an incredibly important decision, and democracy has to be respected. To me, therefore, the most logical answer to that is the final decision should go back to the great British public. There should be a people's vote on the deal.
Okay.
My absolute hardcore vote leave friends also want a vote on the deal because they think they're not going to get the Brexit they voted for. Back to the people. Is the deal what you voted for?
All right. I think that undermines democracy again. You
can't undermine democracy with democracy. That doesn't make sense,
After the result of a general election, if you're not too happy about it, you have another general election a year later.
I'm going to hear some more.
You're going to sign up to a deal and you don't deserve
Richard, I'm going to stop you there, please. The
Which
woman up there,
Richard? Which Richard?
And you. They're both Richards. Actually, I hadn't thought that. Just say Richard, shut up.
Shut up and go away.
I believe that if another referendum is done on the Brexit deal, what if we vote no to the Brexit deal? Are we going to be put into another however many years of shambles of trying to find a new one? Or do we just suddenly decide to forget the first referendum and think, oh, we might as well stay in because no one agreed with the deal that was made?
Parliament needs to step up. I think you're right. Parliament needs to step up.
The woman on the right there in purple. Yes.
Do you know what I find heartbreaking is we're spending our time talking about institutions, but what about the mobility of those across Europe? And are they running out of time on EU citizenship? Because if you won't be able to work across different countries. When I was receiving treatment for cancer 4 years ago in the NHS, they did a fantastic job, and the majority of the staff who treated me were actually not from this country. And now when I go back for my regular checkups and it's just like, oh, well, so-and-so has left, everyone is leaving. So there's that uncertainty going on, and then of course, then there's no funding for the NHS.
All right. And the man up there.
We all know what we voted for in the referendum. I personally voted Remain. We've lost. We know what we need to do. 35 years ago, I negotiated a deal with Wix DIY. They demanded 2.5% discount. If they got their facts straight, they'd have got 15. But it's the best deal I've ever done. We should not be talking about our negotiating strategy. We should be getting on and doing it and not listening to anybody else.
I'd love to know what your deal with... what was your deal with Wix?
It was little bits of metal which weighed an awful lot.
It's got our name on it.
All right, I'll take this woman here, and then we'll go on to another question. The woman in the 1, 2, 3, 4th row there. Yes.
I just think that the way that it's been handled by the Conservative Party is absolutely shambolic, and it's a disgrace to us. People in other countries looking at us, and they're looking at the state that we are in as a country. We can't even get together and agree on something that's been democratically voted. I voted Remain. I agree that that's what democracy has said, that we were going to go and we are going to leave, but the way it's been handled, the way that the Conservatives are going about it is shambolic, and you just need to all get yourselves together and get the job done.
OK.
I totally agree with that.
All right.
The Labour Party, but they're not the ones that are in power that are making the decisions.
Sorry, what do you say?
It absolutely is. We put up from the House of Commons, goes up to the House of Lords, and where does that end up being next? Being thrown back to the House of Commons because the House of Lords has said no thank you.
Are you hearing this up there?
Not at all.
What do you make of it? What do you make of it? Oh, right, you.
Sorry, me.
Yeah, go on.
We're the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. We voted to leave. It says pull up anchor and sail away, OK? And then we'll be able to sort ourselves out. And then...
It's not an Enya song. I mean, Sail Away is a lovely song, but you need to go somewhere, so do you know what I mean?
OK, we'll go on to another question. You want a very brief point. You have to be very brief.
Richard, really, when you say about people say about a second referendum,
I said people's vote on the deal.
OK, OK, same thing. What happens then if it's 52-48 again? Do we then go a third time and a fourth time until we get the answer you want? Or...
You go with the majority.
Okay. I'm just saying, we've already had the majority. But we've already voted on it.
I've always been very clear. Am I allowed to speak? I've always been very clear. The referendum result shows that we should give the government the full support to negotiate the best possible deal for the country. But the country deserves, surely, the right to make sure that this deal that is negotiated is the best deal for the country. Don't you want to see what you're getting?
Damien Hines.
The lady over on this side at the back really put her finger on it when she said, you know, OK, so you have a further referendum between the deal and what? What's the alternative? There is no option to go back to the day before the referendum or to go back the day before Article 50. We have made this decision. There is nothing on the table as an alternative being presented by the EU or anybody else.
So we answer that woman's
it.
question at the back there when she said, is there any time left to do the deal? I think there absolutely is, and you know why? Because industry is going to take over. The head of Audi in Germany made a speech this week saying we've got to do a deal with Britain. The money's going to start to talk. Europe needs us just as much as we need Europe.
Not true.
And that will drive the deal. We're an enormously important factor.
Germany, just so you know how it works, Germany's biggest export market is America, and its second biggest export market is China. Our biggest export market is Germany. In that negotiation, who do you think has the more leverage?
All right.
Well, then, with due respect, you don't understand the negotiation between relative strength.
And Damien Hines, just before we... No, hang on. All right, just before we leave the point, you're saying there is absolutely no way the deal could be rescinded in toto. We couldn't, in any circumstances, go back on a referendum that said we reject this deal if a second referendum came and say, sovereign government, we want to come back in.
Well, there is no offer on the table for, as you say, for coming back in. And, you know, new entrants to the EU come back in on very different terms from what we were on the day before. But, you know, Richard Madeley is right that businesses throughout Europe and you know, populations throughout Europe, throughout the 27 nations, have a real interest in making sure that this happens in a good way. And we have a good partnership because we are close neighbours. I'm not a sailor away, by the way. You know, we're leaving the European Union. We're not leaving Europe, and they are going to continue to be our closest neighbours, and we want to carry on with a very, very close relationship.
A question now from David Newman, please.
Is the planned closure of 31 House of Fraser stores just another nail in the coffin of Britain's high streets?
Alison Phillips.
I think this is terrible news today. I mean, we're looking at 6,000 job losses just to House of Fraser. This comes after Marks and Spencer's recently said that they will be closing stores. We've had BHS going. If you walk down any high street in the country now, you can see them boarded up, and what tends to be left is your nail bars and your coffee shops and charity shops. And I think, first of all, we have to think about the real kind of emotional damage that has on people. Particularly if you live in a small town and going down the town is like a social activity, particularly for elderly people or people who are isolated, that is the shopping centre is the heart of that community. And at the same time, not only are we losing shops, we're losing pubs, we're losing libraries are being closed down, police stations are being closed down. There's a real sense that our town centres are falling apart, and we're going to end up with something like these dreadful places in America where you have to get in a car and drive to a mall somewhere out of town. And there's obviously various reasons. The internet has changed everything. No one can turn the internet off. That's not going away. But I think we also have to remember there's a lot of people not spending money at the moment because they haven't got it. And until such time as they have, we are really going to be struggling.
And so no remedy except more money in the pocket?
Well, that would be a big first step, but there are things that people can do on town centres can do on a local level to try and encourage. Parking is a big issue, the cost of parking. But really, what's really going to kickstart the high street is people having a bit more money in their pockets.
Shami Chakrabarti.
Yeah, well, Alison is spot on. So partly it's the internet, people are shopping online and it's convenient, people enjoy it, etc., etc. But, you know, retail is a big industry in this country, and so there are people who need to be reskilled so they can do other things. However, you're quite right that high streets are part of the beating heart of a town, and so if there's not going to be retail in the same way, then it is incumbent on government to start looking at what the strategy should be to keep those high streets alive. Now, that can be libraries, that can be youth clubs, that can be more money in the pockets, and if people aren't doing their shopping on the high street, they can enjoy hospitality on the high street. But you do need a strategy, and at the moment, I'm not convinced that the government has a strategy for the high street.
The woman in green there.
I'm actually a personal stylist, so unsurprisingly I do spend a lot of time shopping, both in-store and online. I was actually in House of Fraser just before I came here earlier, and it's just, I think brands are really confused now. They're trying to obviously compete with internet shopping, which I understand, but I just don't think they're doing it very well. So I can look at House of Fraser online and they've got some great
sort of stock, etc., and the way they do it is wonderful. But when you go in store, it's just confused, and brands are trying to do too many different things.
Okay, and the woman here. Yes.
I think just going back to what the lady behind me said, I think it is a lot about strategy. There's a lot of competing brands now. Obviously, retail's a big industry, and I think brands such as House of Fraser are using outdated systems, marketing techniques that aren't competing with online brands. And I think we've got to look at the core issue, which is people don't have money in their pockets, and the reason for that is unemployment rates are lower than ever. So how do we expect people to buy stuff?
Richard Reed.
Yeah, well, look, I agree. You're absolutely right. There's just less money in the pocket. Our real income has gone down. This is the beginning of it, unfortunately. I'm in invest in 36 businesses. 36 of those businesses are raising money, essentially, to spend on online advertising through Facebook and platforms like that, and delivering direct to the consumer through Amazon. That's the way it's all going. I make no judgment on that. It's just a bit of empirical fact. I have one request of these multinational, multi-billion companies such as Amazon and Facebook that come in and have huge effects on society, including slightly decimating high streets. I have this one request. Can you please pay your taxes?
Taxes, absolutely.
What would you use the money for?
Well, interestingly, on that point, I used to, about 10 years into Innocent, our tax advisors came and said, if you move your head office to Holland, you'll get a much cheaper corporation tax. And I said, oh, yeah, but we don't want our head office in Holland, we're based in London. And they said, no, you don't really have to move it, you just have to say it's been moved there, and maybe go over there for a couple of meetings and take some minutes. And but isn't that really hooky? And the answer was, yes, it was. It's exactly what all the big tech companies are doing. I just want them to know that I know what you're doing. Yeah. It is hooky. Please stop doing it. Please stop doing it. And what does the money go on? Let's turn every school into a grammar school with that money. Let's put it into the hospital. Let's just... I'd rather not spend it in lorry parks in Dover, but all the good stuff...
But maybe please isn't enough. Maybe something behind the please.
Well, I'll start nicely, but I'll end more aggressively if they don't. But we should, as society, say, come on, you're using our roads, you're going to our schools and hospitals, please pay your taxes.
You, sir.
So, the Minister is staying quiet. What's the government's view?
Minister's not staying quiet.
Being too polite.
What's the government's view that with a loss of communities, loss of shops, you've got a rising gang culture, you've got moped gangs, because there's nothing for these youths to do. They can't go out shopping or eating out. They form gangs and then they start violence.
All right. Well, now, you moved a bit away, and we may get to that later if we have time, but you've moved a bit away. But let's just go back to the original question, which was Britain's High Street, which perhaps is germane to what you were saying.
This is a sad day, the loss of these stores and some of the great names, some very historic names, actually, for individual towns in the various kind of House of Fraser marks. And for the people working there, of course, this is a very uncertain time. And I know in our job centre network, there are people ready with what we call the rapid response unit to make sure that other opportunities are presented to them. Thankfully, of course, we have very low unemployment. I mean, we have the lowest unemployment for 40 years. So there will be job opportunities.
Low wages and jobs that aren't real jobs.
There will be opportunities out there.
0-hour contracts.
Well, I'd like to come on to that, if I may, in a moment. But just staying on high street and retail for the moment, it is true that the internet changes everything. And it's not just something you can say in half a sentence and then move on to talk about other things. It fundamentally changes. How many people in this room have never bought anything online? Right, that proves the point. People with their hands up before had to put them down. I mean, that proves the point. So that changes the economics for our high streets. And actually, for department stores, I think times have been particularly tough. There is some expansion going on, of course, in retail as well. You know, Aldi is opening a lot of stores. The Co-op is opening more stores. But the face of our high streets is changing. And as Shami said, they are fundamental to communities and to social interaction. And I think the town centre of the future will still have retail, because there are some things you can do with experience in a shop that you just can't do on a computer screen. There will be some of that, and the really kind of those brands that do it very well will thrive. But
and
also, actually,
for
things like, but we need other things that bring people into town centres, like nurseries and community centres and coffee shops. We sometimes speak a bit disparagingly about coffee shops, but actually they bring people into towns, they spend some money, they spend time together, and is can be a very positive thing.
I think the point about less money in pockets is valid, but I don't think it's the main thing, because if you think about it, we've gone through many recessions in this country, and the high street has always hunkered down and held on. Obviously, something big has happened, something big has changed, and you're absolutely right about the internet. The internet is convulsing our society. It's changing things like never before. This industry, television. My wife and I did a health show about 15 years ago called Get a Life. It got 8.5 million viewers. It was canned because that was too low a figure. 8.5 million. A show like that today would be doing well to get 3 million. Fleet Street's dying on its bottom. Well, it is, and I write for people.
Except the Daily Mirror.
The sales are nothing like they were before because of the tablet. Everybody's getting their news and information off the tablet. They're watching television on the tablet, and it absolutely applies to the high street. So many people, as you say, quite rightly, are buying online, and they're not going to the shops. God knows how the high street will end up, but it'll never, ever be the same again, and that's because of the internet.
All right. The person over there on the left. The woman in blue.
I think there's like a lot of young people who obviously are getting paid different wages from the ages of 16 to 25. And if we want the high street to stay, for the amount of young people there is, there needs to be more investment in their hours, in their wages. And zero-hour contracts are good occasionally for students and a select group of people. But in total, it's not reliable work. And if you want more investment into the economy from young people, you need to show that back.
Do you want a high street? Why do you want the high street rather than shopping online?
The high street is so useful. It's an iconic thing, whether you have a big shopping centre and then you can go up the high street, whether there's charity shops, coffee shops or whatever. It's a British institution in itself, and we want to keep that.
OK, the man up there in the red shirt. You, sir.
I like the high street. I'm not too keen to buy via the internet and so on, but I agree with Richard Medley. The high street will have to change the way it looks, because the internet is slowly ruining the current shape and look of high streets. And Damien was basically speaking poppycock when he goes, people go in and have a nice experience and so on, and like to handle these goods in the shops and so on. If you take Maplin's as an example, Maplin's has just gone to the wall very recently, and what was happening there apparently was people would go into Maplin's, they would seek advice from the experts in Maplin's and go and buy it cheaper online.
Yes.
And much the same happens in the House of Fraser and so on. You try on the clothes and you go, I'll get that, 20 quid cheaper online. So the shape of the high street's got to change.
OK, we'll go on. Chris Riley, I think it is. Chris Riley, is that right?
That's right,
Riley, yes.
Is it time for failing grailing to go, and is it also time to bring the railways back into public ownership?
Wow, right. Shaman Chakrabarti, you start on this. Shaman?
Yes and yes.
Right.
I don't want to call anybody names. When it gets to the point that you're actually feeling sorry for, so tonight I'm feeling sorry for the Prime Minister and I'm feeling sorry for Mr Grayling, but I feel a lot sorrier for the people struggling to get to work and get home from work every day. And yes, the railways are a natural monopoly. And this fragmented railway, there's no real competition. The prices are out of control. The timetable, Mr Grayling's timetable doesn't work. He can't keep blaming everybody else. It's chaos on the railways. The prices are out of control. The trains don't run on time. The timetable doesn't work. We need an integrated railway service. It needs to be in public hands as a service for the people and not just a game of profiteering for the super rich.
I liked your succinct yes.
Better.
Yes, better.
OK, well,
and presumably you'll say no and no.
and then we're done.
And then we're done. No, I mean, failing grailing, public ownership of the railways.
Well, there are no, but also, I mean, it's clearly appalling what has happened with Govia, Thameslink and Northern Rail in the last couple of weeks. There's no excuses for it. By the way, it involved 2 private sector companies and 1 public sector one. So it's not just a question of private versus public, and it's absolutely essential that lessons are properly learned from this and it doesn't happen again. But when you talk about, nationalising the railways, you have to ask the question, is that really the answer? And remember back to the days of British Rail, when passenger numbers, fell by a third. Actually, since this franchising system has been in, the passenger numbers on the railways have grown really quite dramatically, which of course is also good for the environment and everything else.
Wouldn't the railway industry have learnt anything in the time that's passed?
And the cost of Mr Corbyn's renationalisation plan for the railways is as much as we spend on the health service and our school system in an entire year. So you have to ask the question if you really think that would be worth it, and if actually ultimately you want politicians running the railways.
Why do politicians?
Okay. Richard Madeley. Can I? Don't, please, I'm sorry. Please don't shout out, or I'll have the microphone removed. It's no good sitting there shouting. There are 150 people here who want to speak. If you shout them down all the time, nobody here will hear these people. And they'll only hear you, which isn't fair to 149 other people. Richard Madeley, please.
Right, I'll give a different answer to the previous 2. I would say yes, he absolutely should go. He's useless. Completely useless. And like you, I feel sorry for him. But I would say no to the second part of the question. I think probably on this panel, maybe apart from you, David, I'm the only person to remember British Rail quite clearly. I used to get the train from Essex to Liverpool.
You're way too young. We're way too young for that.
If you think privatised railways are shambolic, you should have tried British Rail. It was awful. It was strike-ridden. The trains were filthy, and I mean seriously filthy, on the outside and on the inside. The timetables were a joke.
The tickets were cheaper.
The tickets were cheaper, but you were buying rubbish, to be honest with you. You were buying rubbish. So I would say, yes, get rid of Grayling, because he's not up to the job. And what I would do, I would be bringing the franchised heads of industry in, like the head of Northern Rail, and saying, you've lost the franchise. You've lost it. You're not up to it. And
so who's going to have it? Who's going to run it then?
Well, you obviously need a time frame in order to get someone to replace them. But, for example, I think Northern Rail have blown it. I don't think they should be allowed to carry on.
Richard Reid.
Yeah, I agree with Richard on that. You cannot reward bad performance. I'm not sure that so if someone's failing in it, you need to take away that franchise. I do not think the right macro choice is to renationalise, just because of your point. It's too much money, and we don't have enough of it, and there's bigger, more pressing things to put it into. But clearly, it's got to be improved. The government does have to do a better job at oversight, and the businesses do have to do a better job of looking after the consumers, and they seem to keep making the chairs, the seats, thinner and less comfortable. Has anyone noticed that? So can we at least keep the seats comfortable? It would be another sort of request I would make.
But it's a natural monopoly. You know, when you're coming from London to Reading, for example, you want to get that train because you want to go and be on question time. You do not have a choice. It's a natural monopoly. It's not like choosing one smoothie over another. They've got you. They've got you by the proverbials, if you pardon my friend.
And I think the other thing we have to
the man in red there, please. The man in red, please.
The government's currently running roughly about a £45 billion deficit. So in regards to nationalisation to the railway, where do they get the money to do that from?
Well, you do it gradually, for a start.
Gradually?
And you, sir, in blue, there.
Yeah, so I think part of the solution could be to look at countries like Japan. So what they do is the private sector and the government, they work very closely together, and the government actually regulates the private sector. So that is the solution, I think. Trying to nationalise the railways is a huge amount of money and it's a huge risk, and there's no guarantee it will work. So the best way to do it is actually to regulate these train companies and to make sure they don't rip off the customers, which they're clearly currently doing.
Hear, hear.
Alistair Phillips.
I think because on top of all the issues that Shami mentioned there earlier about overcrowding, delays, cancellations, we've got to remember also that there's public subsidy that's going towards the railways at the moment. Plus, we've got railway operating companies that are quite often being owned by other countries, other state train operators from across Europe who are making good profits out of it. And we are just ended up with the worst end of this deal. Now, I take some of your points about the old British rail, and I am unfortunately old enough to remember it. Right. But I think what we'll be looking at in the future is a very different form of nationalisation, where you could look at the train operating companies coming back into being state-run. And I think the other interesting thing that has been really flagged up this week is how, yet again, we've seen how the failings of looking at transport and infrastructure outside of London. No one seems to give the merest thought to what's going on outside. All the investment is thrust into London, and by doing a form of nationalisation, you could address that then.
Yeah. Okay. You, sir. Yes.
Is it not a fact that what you're saying here is there's not enough people looking at the problems that we got? You've cited schools, you've cited, I've forgotten it now, but whatever. What you've been discussing tonight has all come down to a lack of strategy. Nobody in the government is looking at anything at all because they're so locked into Brexit. They can't get out of it.
I think you're absolutely right.
Totally.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, we'll take one last quick question from Pippa Sands, and then we must stop. Pippa.
Is it a fair reflection of our society today that more people apply to be on Love Island than Oxbridge?
Apparently, 85,000 people applied to be in Love Island, 23,000 to go to Oxbridge. And Love Island, very popular last year. It was the only programme on television that was more tweeted than Question Time. Richard Madeley.
Yes, it is a reflection of our times, clearly. I'm not sure quite what it says, other than the cult of celebrity and instant fame has become almost universal, particularly amongst young people. Young people see becoming a celebrity as their passport to wealth and success, and in many ways they're right. Most of the people who've been on previous Love Islands, even those who didn't come close to winning it, have gone on to get quite lucrative contracts, promoting things. They've got this golden kiss of fame, which they're so hungry for. I don't think there's anything you can do about it, and increasingly universities are seen as not a particularly good route to getting a job.
Okay, well, you've answered the question on behalf of all the banks. We've only got a minute left. Very brief. Sorry.
What's the harm in it?
Oh, there's huge harm in it.
Then people are going on to find love. That's fine
they
with
can
me.
find love.
Alison.
Well, and as I think somebody pointed out the other day, maybe is it because Love Island takes more people from ethnic minorities than state schools?
Exactly.
Shami, very briefly.
I understand why people want to get paid to go on on holiday, but people ought to be paid to go to university and not have to ratchet up these enormous debts.
Okay. Very quick.
Okay, so how do you answer this question if you've never seen Love Island? I'm really sorry. So I'm going to say something brief about university instead. I want our top universities to widen the net and make sure they're attracting students from all different backgrounds. I also want to make sure there are good alternatives for young people who don't want to go to university, like good degree apprenticeships and other types of apprenticeships.
Right. Well, you have to go and watch Love Island.
And I'll go watch Love Island later.
Lots of politicians are now tweeting they have to watch Love Island. Our time's up, I'm afraid. That's it for tonight. I'll be back on Wednesday this week with a panorama special about Putin's Russia at 9 o'clock, but I'll be back again on Thursday too with Question Time. And Question Time will be in Carnarvon. And the week after that in Birmingham, 03301239988 is the number to call, or you can apply at the website there. If you want to go on debating these things, many topics we've covered, Adrian Childs is there on Question Time, Extra Time on BBC 5 Live. Here, my thanks to our extremely loquacious panel and an even more loquacious audience in Reading. Thank you all very much. Until next Thursday from Question Time, good night.